The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 25, Planting in Scorched Earth. Growth against the odds. Welcome back to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, the space where we strip away the layers, sit with the raw stuff, and talk about what most people skip past. Today, we're talking about something easy to romanticize but hard to live through. Growth in places that feel like they've been stripped bare. Even burnt soil can bloom, but in the middle of the ashes, that's not always how it feels. Maybe you've been through a chapter where everything was uprooted. The work you'd poured yourself into, the relationships you thought would last, even the version of yourself you'd been building for years. The ground beneath you didn't just crack, it scorched. And when that happens, the very idea of planting anything again can feel almost absurd. But life has a strange way of working in the margins. Healing often starts in places we've written off as hopeless. Creativity, connection, and opportunity can take root in conditions we'd never choose, and often when we've stopped looking for them. This episode is about noticing those first fragile signs of life, about learning to see possibility in wasteland moments, and trusting that beauty can still grow in the most unexpected places. So let's begin. Seeds beneath the ashes. This part explores the paradox of growth in unlikely conditions. Burnt soil, the emotional, relational, or situational wastelands of our lives, can still hold dormant seeds. We'll unpack how to recognize and nurture those seeds when they're invisible, and how patience and self-trust play critical roles in that process. Themes and attributes. Resilience, recognizing the growth potential even when life feels barren. Hope under pressure, understanding that beauty and meaning can emerge from difficulty. Patience, trusting slow, unseen processes rather than forcing rapid results. Adaptation, learning to work with what is, not what we wish it were. The charred field after a wildfire. A forest floor looks lifeless, blackened earth, the air heavy with the smell of smoke. Yet ecologists know something else is happening. Beneath the surface, seeds that have lain dormant for years are cracking open, activated by the very heat that seemed to destroy everything. The devastation becomes the trigger for new life. Our lives can feel like those charred fields. After loss, betrayal, burnout, or collapse, the surface can look empty. But unseen changes are happening underground in our perspectives, in our capacity, in our inner architecture. The challenge is that we don't get to see the sprouts right away. We have to keep tending to the ground that still looks dead, trusting that life will return in its own time. Personal reflection. There have been many moments when my soul felt scorched, times when I truly didn't know if I'd make it through my storms. Starting over again and again was exhausting, and I'd often hit points where hope felt thin. My work on the Inversiverse is one example. I spent nearly 8 months procrastinating on research, feeling stuck in a loop. Part of me knew I needed help or fresh energy to move forward, but those avenues didn't open. It was frustrating. The vision was clear, but the soil felt depleted. In relationships, I've had seasons where I needed more space than usual. I'd explain as best I could that I wasn't withdrawing because of disconnection. I still felt deeply connected, but because I was depleted. My nervous system needed time to reset. Back then, I didn't have the language to explain this well. People sometimes saw it as me pushing them away, which added another layer of hurt. With time and self-development, I learned to recognize that what I was experiencing wasn't rejection, it was repair. That shift in understanding has been powerful. I began seeing the same patterns in others, too, and I realized that not every distance is abandonment. Sometimes it's maintenance. Even when the surface feels dry, something is still alive underneath. Psychological insight. When I think back on those depleted periods, I can see now how they held the seeds for growth, even when I felt motionless. Psychologists Tedeschi and Calhoun describe this as post-traumatic growth, the positive changes that can happen as a result of struggling with highly challenging life circumstances. I didn't know that term at the time, but I've lived it. During the months my Inversiverse work was stalled, the pause gave me space to refine my purpose and direction. I wasn't just sitting in ashes, I was letting the soil recover. That patience made the next phase of the work more aligned and sustainable. In relationships, my need for space was tied to self-regulation, what stress research calls restoring homeostasis in the nervous system, McEwen, 1998. By stepping back, I wasn't avoiding connection, I was protecting it. It's like those fire-activated seeds. The heat challenge changes the conditions so new possibilities can emerge. I've learned to trust that even in wasteland moments, unseen processes are happening. The soil is changing, nutrients are shifting, and when the first shoots appear, they're often stronger than what grew before. That's the gift of scorched earth. The new growth is adapted to survive the very heat that brought it to life. Insight prompts. Where in your life have you felt like the soil was too burnt for anything to grow? What dormant seeds might still be present in that space, even if you can't see them yet? Theory in action, identify one area of your life that feels barren or depleted. Write down 3 actions you can take to gently water the soil. These could be small habits, intentional pauses, or shifting your perspective. Commit to these actions for 1 month without expecting immediate results, and note any subtle changes. The first green shoots. Even in the harshest landscapes, the smallest signs of life can be the most important. When you've been through a season of loss, grief, or collapse, the first green shoots. Small but undeniable signs of growth can be easy to overlook or dismiss. This part of the journey asks us to slow down enough to notice them, to protect them from the elements, and to trust that they mean something bigger is possible. Themes and attributes patience as protection, understanding that not all growth can be rushed. Mindful observation, training yourself to notice small changes and progress. Nurturing vulnerability, safeguarding what's tender and new before it's strong enough to stand on its own. A single leaf in the ash, imagine walking through a charred forest weeks after a fire. The trees are blackened, the ground still smells faintly of smoke, and the silence feels heavy. Then you see it, a single bright green leaf pushing out from a scorched stem. It doesn't look like much in the scale of what's been lost, but at that moment, it's everything. That one leaf changes the way you see the whole scene. Suddenly, the forest isn't just a place of destruction, but of quiet resilience. You start to notice other small shoots breaking through the ash. They were there before, but your eyes weren't ready to see them. The first signs of emotional or personal recovery are like that. They don't come with fireworks. They come quietly, in the way you laugh without forcing it, the way you sleep a little better, the way you notice beauty without effort. These moments are fragile, but they're also powerful. They are the blueprint of your next chapter. Personal reflection. I've had moments where my green shoot was something as small as waking up without the knot in my stomach, or feeling genuinely curious about my work again after months of dragging myself through it. When I was in the long stall with my inversiverse research, there was a day I caught myself scribbling down an idea without overthinking it, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. That felt like the first leaf in the ash. In relationships, too, I've noticed these moments. A genuine smile when I didn't think I had the energy. A conversation where I felt safe enough to share without measuring every word. At the time, those moments seemed tiny compared to what I'd lost, but looking back, they were the signs that something in me was beginning to heal. The hardest part was not rushing to build everything back at once when I saw those early signs. My instinct was to treat them as proof that I was back to normal and push myself harder, but that only set me back. I've learned that those small signs are an invitation to nurture, not accelerate. Psychological insight. What I've come to understand is that these first signs of recovery align with what psychologist Barbara Fredrickson calls micro-moments of positivity. Her research shows that even small, fleeting positive emotions like contentment, amusement, or curiosity can start to rebuild psychological resilience. They act like seeds, slowly expanding our capacity for well-being. In my own life, when I noticed those early sparks, the idea for a piece of inversiverse content, or the ability to enjoy a conversation, they weren't just pleasant moments. They were physiological signals that my nervous system was shifting out of prolonged stress. Polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, helps explain this. When our bodies feel safe enough, even briefly, we naturally open up to connection, creativity, and learning. The trick is, I've learned, not to smother those shoots with the weight of expectation. I used to think, if I'm feeling better, I should be able to do more now, which often pushed me back into depletion. Now I see those moments as something to protect, to give them the right light, water, and time, so they can grow strong enough to survive without constant tending. Insight prompts. What's the smallest recent sign that you might be starting to heal or grow, even if life still feels hard overall? How can you protect and nurture that sign without turning it into pressure? Theory and action pick one green shoot in your life, a small but meaningful sign of progress. For the next week, commit to noticing it without trying to expand it. Instead, focus on giving it the conditions it needs to flourish, which might mean more rest, gentler self-talk, or time away from draining situations. Let growth happen at its own pace. Roots before branches. When we rebuild after loss or crisis, it's tempting to focus on what can be seen, the visible progress, the outward markers of getting better. But the truth is, most real stability happens underground, in places no one else can see. This is the work of putting down roots before we let new branches grow. Themes and attributes. Invisible progress, recognizing the value of work that doesn't yet show results. Long-term stability, building systems and habits that sustain growth over time. Self-trust, believing in your unseen efforts, even when others can't yet. The hidden work, think about a young tree planted in a storm-prone place. Above the surface, not much changes for a while, the same thin trunk, the same small cluster of leaves. But underground, the roots are stretching deep, anchoring themselves into the soil. The tree's energy isn't going into showing off its height, it's going into making sure it can survive the next gale. In life, we often rush to grow branches, to make something visible so the world knows we're doing well. But without roots, those branches can't hold the weight of what's coming. The strongest growth I've seen in myself and others has always started quietly in the unseen routines, the self-honesty, the boundaries no one claps for, personal reflection. I've had stretches where it felt like nothing was moving forward. With my Inversiverse work, there were months where I was researching, journaling, and reflecting, but not producing anything I could show publicly. I worried that I was falling behind, or that people would think I'd given up. But over time, I saw that those quiet months were when I built the foundation for everything I've been creating since. I was clarifying my ideas, testing my own beliefs, and learning to stick to my values when it would have been easier to copy what others were doing for quicker results. In relationships too, I've seen this. Sometimes the real work of repair isn't in dramatic gestures, but in the patient's choice to listen more deeply, to respond with care even when you feel defensive, and to hold your boundaries consistently. Those things don't always get noticed, but they are the roots that keep a connection from toppling in the wind. Psychological insight. One of the clearest psychological parallels to this stage is found in delayed gratification research, famously studied by Walter Mischel in the marshmallow test. The ability to wait for a greater reward, to invest in what isn't immediately visible, is a key predictor of long-term success and well-being. In my life, this has meant resisting the urge to prove my progress through quick, flashy wins, and instead trusting the slower, less visible work. Another layer of this is what James Clear calls latent potential in his work on habit formation. He explains that much of the progress we make early on in change is stored up invisible, like ice that stays frozen until it suddenly melts at 0 degrees Celsius. That metaphor helped me see that the weeks I spent quietly researching or reflecting weren't wasted. They were the exact conditions needed for breakthroughs later. In relationships, the same principle applies. According to John Gottman's research on relationship stability, small daily acts of trust building and respect, most of which go unnoticed, create what he calls an emotional bank account. This reserve is what allows couples, friends, or families to survive inevitable conflicts without collapsing. For me, focusing on those unseen deposits has often mattered far more than any single grand gesture. Insight prompts. Where in your life are you quietly putting down roots, even if no one else can see the progress? How can you remind yourself that unseen work is still real and valuable? Theory and action, pick one area where you feel pressure to show progress. This week, Commit to focusing only on the foundation, the routines, practices, or boundaries that strengthen you beneath the surface. At the end of the week, reflect on how it feels to value the invisible work without needing visible validation. Cracks that let the light in growth against the odds isn't just about strength, it's about permeability. When we've been through fire, it's natural to want to seal ourselves off so nothing can hurt us again. But if we become too sealed, nothing good can get in either. This part is about the paradox of protection, keeping yourself safe while still allowing the light of new possibilities to enter. Themes and attributes selective openness, learning to allow in what nourishes while blocking what harms. Post-adversity receptivity, remaining available to life after loss or betrayal. The healing paradox protection and vulnerability working together. The wall and the window after a fire, the instinct is to rebuild walls thick, high, impenetrable. We imagine that if nothing can reach us, nothing can hurt us. But imagine a house with no windows. Safe from intrusion, yes, but also cut off from the sunlight, the fresh air, the sound of birds at dawn. The truth is, the safest homes have both walls and windows. Strong enough to protect, open enough to breathe. I've learned the same is true for the spaces inside me. Too open, and I'm exposed to every gust. Too closed, and I'm starving for the warmth that only connection can bring. Personal reflection. I can remember times when I closed myself off entirely after being hurt. Not just from the person who hurt me, but from almost everyone. I'd retreat, avoiding calls, messages, and opportunities, convincing myself that isolation was the only safe option. And in some cases, it was necessary at first. But the longer I stayed in that closed space, the more I realized I was also shutting out the very things that might help me heal. Friendships that had nothing to do with the hurt, opportunities to collaborate. Even simple pleasures like sitting in a cafe surrounded by strangers. In my work on the Inversiverse, there were moments I had to let others' feedback in, even when it was uncomfortable, because without that input, and the project couldn't grow. And in personal relationships, I've learned to create what I call half-open windows, letting people close enough to see me, but not close enough to dismantle the structure I've fought to rebuild. Psychological insight. In psychology, this balance is closely related to the concept of boundary permeability. Altman, 1975, which examines how individuals manage the flow of information, energy, and intimacy between themselves and the outside world. For me, this means knowing when to shift from closed to slightly open without flinging the door wide too soon. Brené Brown's research on vulnerability has shaped how I view this. She emphasizes that vulnerability without boundaries is not vulnerability, it's exposure. The key is being deliberate about who gets access, when and how. I've lived this lesson in moments when I was tempted to over-explain or overshare to be understood, only to realize later that my openness had not been met with care. I've also seen parallels in trauma recovery frameworks like Judith Herman's stages of recovery, where establishing safety is the first phase, but reconnection is essential for full healing. Staying in the safety phase too long can keep a person in a kind of emotional quarantine. My own experience mirrors this. When I've stayed sealed off, my world has shrunk. When I've opened a window, even cautiously, my capacity to heal has expanded. Insight prompts. Where in your life might you be keeping the walls too high for light to get in? What would a half-open window look like for you in a current challenge? Theory in action. Choose one safe, low-stakes way to open a window this week. It could be joining a group activity, accepting a small collaboration, or allowing someone to help you with a minor task. Notice how it feels to receive something without dismantling your walls. Seeds in the ashes. Even the most scorched landscapes hold the quiet promise of renewal. The aftermath of hardship can feel like a wasteland, stripped of color, stripped of what felt alive. But nature knows something we often forget. The very conditions that seem barren can be the birthplace of unexpected growth. In this part, we explore what it means to plant when the soil still looks inhospitable, and why trusting that process can become one of the most profound acts of self-belief. Themes and attributes resilience, cultivating strength in uncertain conditions, patience, trusting growth without visible results, creativity, finding new ways to nourish yourself in scarcity, hope, choosing to believe in potential despite appearances. Adaptation, shaping your approach to fit the environment, not forcing it the first shoots. When you picture scorched earth, you might imagine it as lifeless, blackened soil, ash swirling in the wind, the memory of what once stood still hanging in the air. It's the kind of place you expect nothing to return to for years, maybe decades. And yet nature has a quiet way of proving us wrong. In the months after a fire, small shoots begin to break through the ash. Not because the conditions are ideal, but because some seeds need fire to germinate. The destruction itself creates the conditions for new life. We all have seasons where our internal landscape feels burnt out, where so much has been stripped away that we can't imagine anything good growing there again. And still, something in us begins to stir. The first ideas, the first hopeful conversations, the first sense of lightness after a long heaviness. It's not about pretending the loss didn't happen. It's about recognizing that even here, in ground we thought was ruined, life can take root again. Personal reflection. There have been chapters in my life when the idea of planting anything new felt absurd. My energy was depleted, my sense of stability thin at best. After long stretches of challenge in work, in relationships, in my health, the thought of starting again seemed like setting myself up for another disappointment. When I first started working on the Inversiverse, I went through months where my momentum was completely gone. The research sat there untouched, ideas still circling in my mind but refusing to land. I wanted conditions to feel right before I pushed forward, but the truth is they never did. What shifted wasn't the external situation. I decided to plant something anyway, even if I wasn't sure it would take. I've had the same experience in personal connections. Times when the ground between me and another person felt burnt, trust shaken, communication fractured. Part of me wanted to walk away until it all looked safe again, but there were moments where I chose to sow something small instead. A message sent without expectation, a gesture of goodwill, an openness to seeing if something could grow from what was left. Not everything I planted survived, but some of it did, and it surprised me in ways I couldn't have predicted. It reminded me that starting small doesn't make the act insignificant. Sometimes those small beginnings hold more power than the grand rebuilds we imagine. Psychological insight. In psychology, there's a concept called psychological capital. Luthans, Youssef, and Avolio, 2007, which refers to the inner resources of hope, efficacy, resilience, and optimism that help us persist through difficulty. What's fascinating is that these qualities often grow stronger because of adversity, not despite it. My own life echoes that research. It's been the periods of depletion, not comfort, that have pushed me to develop deeper reserves of patience and creativity. Another relevant idea is post-traumatic growth. Tedeschi and Calhoun, 2004. It's the process by which facing profound challenges reshapes us in ways that allow for unexpected renewal, whether in self-understanding, relationships, or life philosophy. I've seen this in myself when choosing to act, even in small, cautious ways before conditions felt safe. When I began to plant new ideas for the Inversiverse amidst uncertainty, I was unknowingly engaging in what's called future-oriented coping. Aspinwall and Taylor, 1997. I wasn't reacting to a problem. I was preparing the ground for something better, trusting that tending to small steps now would make a difference later. That mindset shift from waiting for perfect to honoring the imperfect start is what has allowed me to keep going in times when the easier choice would have been to give up entirely. Insight prompts. What's one area of your life where you've been waiting for perfect conditions before you begin? What's a single small action you could take now to plant something in that space, even if the soil still feels barren? Theory in action. The next time you feel stuck because the circumstances don't seem right, write down 3 imperfect actions you could take anyway. Pick one and commit to it. Treat it as a seed, not the full garden, and give it your attention for a week. Notice whether tending to that seed shifts how you feel about the ground you're standing on. Roots and reach. When new growth appears, it's tempting to focus only on what's above the surface, the visible signs of progress, the parts the world can see. But in the early stages of renewal, the real work is happening below ground. Roots take time to spread, to anchor, to find their way to sources of nourishment. In life, this means strengthening the foundations that will hold your new growth steady when the winds come. Themes and attribute stability, ensuring your growth has something solid to anchor to depth, going beyond surface progress into the unseen work nourishment, identifying what truly sustains you endurance, preparing for challenges by building inner reserves balance, knowing when to expand and when to consolidate the hidden work. A gardener knows something that an onlooker might miss. The first weeks after planting aren't about what's above the soil. You could walk past a patch of bare ground and think nothing is happening, but underground, roots are quietly mapping the terrain, testing where water flows, avoiding rocks, and weaving into a network strong enough to feed the plant for years. In our own lives, this root building phase is the part most people overlook. We're conditioned to equate progress with visibility, the launch, the announcement, the display of results. But without roots, anything that grows tall will topple at the first storm. When I look back at times I rushed forward, I can see how often I skipped this stage. I wanted the structure before I'd laid the foundation. I wanted the connection before I'd built the trust. And inevitably, when pressure came, what I'd built felt shaky, not because the idea or the relationship lacked potential, but because I hadn't allowed the roots to do their work. Roots are invisible to the outside world, but they're where resilience is formed. They determine not only how tall you can grow, but how well you can survive when things turn harsh again. Personal reflection. I've had many moments in life where I wanted results fast. With the Inversiverse, especially in the early stages, I was tempted to push content out before I'd established my voice and clarity. I wanted the world to see it taking shape, to feel that momentum. But the truth is, the real growth happened in the quieter work, the hours spent refining ideas, the time taken to explore connections between concepts, the space to let certain ideas sit before deciding how they fit. In personal relationships, too, I've learned the cost of skipping this root work. There were times when a connection felt immediate and alive, and I wanted to deepen it quickly. But when misunderstandings came, as they always do, the lack of deeper grounding meant the whole thing could shift or collapse overnight. These days, I take more time. I let trust build at its own pace, not because I'm withholding, but because I know that strong roots give both people something to hold on to when things get tested. It's not always easy to value the unseen work when there's pressure to show progress. But I've learned to remind myself, the deeper the roots, the greater the reach. Psychological insight in developmental psychology, the principle of secure base theory, Bowlby, 1988, explains that our ability to explore and take risks depends on having a reliable source of safety to return to. In plants, the secure base is the root system. In human life, it's the structures, habits, and relationships that keep us grounded. Without this stability, exploration becomes riskier and recovery from setbacks is harder. I've noticed in my work that when I invest in building my root system, consistent creative routines, a clear set of values, and supportive relationships, my capacity for growth increases. This mirrors research on resilience frameworks, Masson 2001, which shows that adaptability in the face of stress often comes from strong, pre-existing foundations, not from reacting in the moment. Another concept that resonates is delayed gratification, Michel, 1972. Waiting for roots to form is an act of restraint, choosing to strengthen the unseen so the visible can endure. This isn't passivity, it's strategic patience, the same principle that underlies long-term success in both personal and professional contexts. For me, the shift came when I started to view the invisible work as progress in itself. Those seasons where nothing looked different on the outside were often the times I was becoming most prepared for what was to come. Insight prompts. Where in your life are you focusing on visible growth at the expense of deeper roots? What unseen work could you invest in now that would give you greater stability later? Theory in action. Choose one area of your life, a project, a relationship, or a personal goal, and map out what its roots might be. These could be skills, habits, values, or resources that keep it steady. For the next 2 weeks, commit to strengthening one of these roots without pushing for visible results. Track how your sense of stability changes. The wasteland in bloom. If there's a thread that runs through the entire idea of planting in scorched earth, it's this: the places we've written off often hold the greatest potential for transformation. What appears ruined, depleted, or barren isn't always the end. Sometimes it's the clearing we didn't know we needed. This part is about recognizing when life is already taking root in places we thought were beyond saving, and choosing to nurture it instead of walking away. Themes and attributes: resilience, the ability to thrive in environments that appear hopeless. Perception shift, seeing beyond the damage to notice subtle growth. Patience, allowing growth to happen at its own pace without forcing it. Gratitude, valuing progress, no matter how small or unexpected the unexpected color. There's something about the first flash of color in a place that's been grey for too long. It might be a single wildflower pushing through cracked pavement, or a patch of moss thriving in a shadowed corner. You almost miss it. It's so small compared to the emptiness around it, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. That moment changes the way you look at the space. It's no longer just broken or abandoned. It's alive, even if only in a tiny way. That single point of color becomes proof that the story isn't over, that nature hasn't given up. And if it hasn't, maybe you don't have to either. In our own lives, these unexpected colors often show up quietly. A small gesture of kindness when we least expect it. A laugh that catches us off guard in the middle of grief. A creative idea that slips in while we're still convincing ourselves we're not ready. The wasteland starts to bloom long before the landscape looks whole again. Personal reflection. I've had moments when I thought the only thing left in a situation was the emptiness. When a project had stalled for so long, I was sure it was over. When relationships felt stripped of any warmth, I assumed the connection had completely died. But then something small would happen, not enough to rebuild everything at once, but enough to shift my perspective. In my work, it might be a message from someone who found meaning in something I'd created months ago, reminding me why I began. In relationships, it could be an unexpected moment of understanding in an otherwise distant conversation. These moments didn't fix the whole picture instantly, but they were like those first shoots breaking through the ash. They reminded me that growth doesn't need my constant control to happen. Sometimes it unfolds quietly while I'm still doubting it. And when I learned to spot those signs earlier, I could lean into them instead of walking away too soon. Psychological insight. Psychologically, these moments tap into what Barbara Fredrickson calls the broaden and build theory of positive emotions. Small experiences of joy, gratitude, or hope don't just feel good. They expand our mental, emotional, and behavioral repertoires, allowing us to see more possibilities and build resilience over time. From my perspective, I've seen how noticing these tiny blooms has interrupted my tendency to assume nothing can change. In the past, I might have dismissed them as insignificant, focusing instead on the bigger problems. But when I consciously recognized them, I found myself feeling more grounded, less reactive, and more willing to keep going. There's also a neurological element here: neuroplasticity. By repeatedly directing attention to small, positive changes, we strengthen the neural pathways that help us expect and therefore notice future growth. Over time, this rewires the way we see our circumstances. It's not about false positivity. It's about training the brain to notice that even in the hardest seasons, life has a way of finding cracks to slip through. Insight prompts 1. Can you recall a time when something small shifted your perspective during a difficult season? 2. How can you train yourself to notice unexpected color in your daily environment? Theory in action. For 1 week, set a daily reminder to record a single small bloom, a moment, observation, or interaction that brings even a flicker of hope or joy. At the end of the week, review them and notice the patterns. This practice builds your capacity to recognize growth, even when the bigger picture still feels incomplete. Roots in the ashes. The truth is, scorched earth doesn't mean dead earth. What looks like a wasteland from one angle can, with time and care, become fertile ground again. Sometimes the growth is slow, uneven, and almost invisible, but that doesn't make it any less real. If you take nothing else from this conversation, take this: your life can still surprise you. Even in seasons that feel stripped of color, something is forming beneath the surface. And one day, without warning, it will push through, just enough for you to notice. When it does, honor it, protect it. Give it the light and space it needs to grow, because those small beginnings are not just the signs of recovery, they are the foundation for what comes next. You've been listening to The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and keep an eye out for the wildflowers, James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of The Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse: a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within traces food, frequency, and the forgotten intelligence of the body. Episode 20 Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.